This is the business Blackbook, where billion-dollar empires are built and collapse. Russia is spending $150 billion a year on a war it cannot afford to win, and somehow its economy is still growing. How is that even possible? Let us understand this system from the very beginning. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022, the world expected its economy to collapse within months. Western leaders were confident. Sanctions were rolled out at a scale never seen before. The ruble was expected to become worthless. Trade was being cut off. Banks were being frozen. The message from the West was clear. Russia would run out of money and the war would stop. But here we are, more than 3 years later, and Russia's economy is not just surviving. In 2024, it actually outpaced the economic growth of most advanced nations, including the United States. So the real question is not whether Russia is struggling. The real question is, how did a sanctioned country running an expensive war somehow manage to keep its economy alive? And how much longer can it keep doing this? Let us first understand what is actually happening inside the Russian economy right now. Before the war, Russia's defense budget was around $50 billion a year. That is already a significant number. But now, in 2025, Russia is spending close to $150 billion a year on its military. That is 3 times what it was spending just a few years ago. Think about what that kind of spending does to an economy. When a government spends money on weapons, on ammunition, on military vehicles, on soldiers' salaries, that money does not disappear. It flows into factories. It flows into workers' pockets. It flows into supply chains. In economic terms, this is called a stimulus. The government is injecting massive amounts of money directly into the domestic economy, and that is exactly what happened in Russia. Factories that were making bread started making drones. Ordinary manufacturing units switched to producing military equipment. The entire industrial base of Russia began reorienting itself around one goal: supplying the war effort. Now, here is something that might surprise you. Russia's unemployment rate has fallen to a 30-year low. Think about that. A country at war, under the heaviest sanctions in modern history, is experiencing near full employment. Workers are in demand. Wages have been rising. And for the average Russian citizen, at least on paper, their standard of living has actually improved. This is what economists call a war economy, when military spending becomes the engine of growth, when the state essentially becomes the largest employer and the largest customer at the same time. Industries produce not because the market demands it, but because the government orders it. It creates jobs. It creates activity. It creates the appearance of a healthy economy. But the word there is appearance. Now let us understand the other side of this equation, because the stimulus alone does not explain the full picture. Russia has oil, and oil, even in a sanctioned world, finds buyers. The energy sector makes up around 20% of Russia's GDP, and more importantly, oil and gas revenues fund anywhere between 1/3 to 1/2 of Russia's annual government budget. That is an enormous dependency. When oil prices are high, Russia has money to spend. When oil prices fall, the budget starts to crack. Now, when sanctions were applied, Europe, which was one of Russia's biggest customers for energy, began cutting off purchases. That was a significant blow. But Russia did not simply lose that revenue and collapse. Instead, it reoriented. China and India stepped in. Today, China and India together account for almost half of all Russian exports. Russia began selling its oil at discounted prices to these countries, and in return, it kept the cash flowing. The pipeline of money never fully stopped, it just changed direction. This is why the sanctions, while damaging, did not deliver the knockout punch that Western leaders expected. The economic world is not a closed system. When one door closes, another market opens. And in this case, two enormous markets with a combined population of nearly 3 billion people chose economic interest over geopolitical pressure. So now you understand the two engines keeping Russia's war economy alive. One, massive government military spending that acts as an internal economic stimulus. Two, continued oil and gas revenues flowing in from China and India despite Western sanctions. But here is where the story gets complicated. And this is the part most people do not fully understand. Russia is spending more than it is earning, even with oil revenues, even with a redirected export market. The military expenditure is so enormous that Russia is running a budget deficit. And to cover that deficit, it has been drawing down from its national wealth fund, which is essentially Russia's savings account built up during years of high oil prices. And that savings account is running out. Analysts who study Russian finances closely estimate that at the current rate of spending, Russia's remaining reserves could be exhausted by approximately 2030. That is roughly 5 years from now. Now, let us address some common misconceptions because this topic generates a lot of confusion. The first misconception is that Russia's economic growth means Russia is winning economically. That is not accurate. Growth in a war economy does not mean prosperity. It means the government is spending aggressively, and that spending is showing up in GDP numbers. But it is not sustainable growth. It is not growth driven by innovation or trade or productivity. It is growth powered by burning through savings and printing obligations. The moment the spending stops, the growth stops with it. The second misconception is that sanctions have completely failed. Also, not accurate. Sanctions have absolutely damaged Russia. They have cut it off from advanced technology. They have removed it from major Western financial systems. They have forced it to buy weapons components from less reliable sources at higher prices. They have increased inflation significantly. What sanctions have not done is collapse the economy instantly, but they are creating long-term structural damage that will compound over time. The third misconception is that Russia can simply keep this up indefinitely because it has oil. Oil is not infinite protection. If oil prices fall, if China and India are pressured to reduce purchases, if secondary sanctions are applied to countries that buy Russian oil, the financial pressure on Moscow increases dramatically. Let us talk about that secondary sanction scenario specifically, because this is where things could get very serious very quickly. There has been discussion, particularly from the Trump administration in 2025, about imposing 100% secondary tariffs on countries that continue to buy Russian oil. What that means practically is if China buys Russian oil and then exports goods to the United States, those goods could face a massive tariff penalty. Now, China and India together account for almost half of all Russian exports. If even a portion of that trade is disrupted, the impact on Russia's budget would be enormous. Russia earns anywhere from 1/3 to 1/2 of its entire government budget from oil and gas. Disrupting those flows would not just slow Russia down, it could force a genuine fiscal crisis. But here is the global consequence that makes this complicated. If China and India stopped buying Russian oil, that oil does not simply disappear from the market. Russia would be forced to reduce production or sell at even more desperate discounts, and the global oil supply would effectively tighten. That could cause oil prices to spike dramatically worldwide, which means the countries applying the pressure could themselves face economic pain through higher energy costs. This is the difficult reality of economic warfare. The weapons cut in multiple directions. Now, let us talk about what the real timeline looks like. 2025 is expected to be the peak of Russia's defense spending. Analysts believe that if a ceasefire happens, defense spending will begin to moderate, but moderate does not mean return to pre-war levels. Russia has spent 3 years building a military-industrial complex. It will not simply shut that down. The spending will remain elevated because Russia's political calculation now includes preparing for future conflicts, not just the one in Ukraine. Putin and his government have consistently framed NATO as a long-term threat. The war in Ukraine, from Moscow's perspective, is not an isolated incident. It is part of a longer confrontation with the West, which means even after a ceasefire, Russia's economic model will likely remain oriented around defense spending. That means the fiscal pressure does not go away. It just slows down slightly. So let us now think about what a financially aware person should take away from all of this. Russia's economy is not thriving in the way a healthy economy thrives. It is being kept alive by two temporary mechanisms: aggressive government, military spending, and oil revenues from a redirected but fragile trade relationship. Both of these have limits. The military spending is draining reserves faster than they can be replenished. The oil revenues depend entirely on China and India continuing to prioritize economic interest over diplomatic pressure, and both of those factors can shift. The deeper lesson here is about how war distorts economics. War creates the illusion of economic activity. Jobs appear, factories run, GDP numbers look healthy, but underneath, the fundamentals weaken, debt rises, productivity falls, innovation stagnates. And when the spending finally stops, the economy does not land gently. It adjusts, often painfully. Russia is not an exception to economic logic. It is simply delaying the encounter with it. The question of how long Russia can sustain this is ultimately a question of how long it can delay that encounter. The math says not much longer than 2030. The politics say Putin will push that limit as far as it can go. And for the rest of the world, watching this unfold means watching an economy built on war spending either find an exit or eventually run out of road. And with that, the Blackbook closes. Subscribe, and we will open the next page soon.